Chapter 2. Patterns. The thread should have been forgettable. That was what bothered Barnes most. Not its tone, not the clipped, sterile confidence of the handles inside it, not even the strange language sitting inside a board that usually treated destruction like a trade show for sociopaths. What bothered him was the shape of the thing, the way it looked at first glance like one more ugly conversation in a sea of ugly conversations. One more hidden service thread, full of people trying to sound smarter, colder, and better funded than they probably were. That was how dangerous things got missed. They arrived dressed as administrative boredom. Barnes sat in the safe house with the monitor glow painting hard angles into his face and scrolled back to the beginning of the thread again. Window confirmation. He hated the title now, not because it was dramatic, because it wasn't dramatic enough. If this had been ransomware people, they would have titled it something adolescent and theatrical. Last Laugh Harvest Day, Lazarus Tax, some nonsense written by men whose mothers should have confiscated their keyboards early. If it had been ordinary infrastructure brokers, the title would have been even duller and more transactional. Muni Access Batch, ICS Corridor, Need Loader / Have Root. Instead, it sat in the middle, dry, formal, slightly wrong. He drank the coffee because self-respect had already failed to prevent the rest of the evening, and there seemed little point making a stand now. Across the room, Ed was at the shelf inventorying what remained of their canned food, like he suspected one of the soup tins had lied to him personally. "You're making that face again," Ed said. Barnes did not look up. "I have many faces." But this one says you found a problem and want it to become a profession." "That is incredibly unfair." "It true?" Barnes clicked back through the replies. "Unfortunately." Rain traced the basement window in thin silver seams. Somewhere above, the city groaned. Metal under wind, distant siren, one short burst of shouting, then the usual administrative silence of a place already learning how not to notice itself dying. He opened his notes file and began rebuilding the thread from scratch. Not reading it now, reconstructing it. There was a difference. Reading was passive. Reading let language cast its spell and walk past your defenses wearing whatever costume it liked. Reconstruction stripped the costume off. It made people live in sequence, forced the lazy little choices into the light. When they posted, how they replied, what terms they repeated, where they slipped, which phrases arrived too cleanly to be native. Barnes trusted timelines the way some men trusted priests. He highlighted the first 6 posts and built a narrow table in plain text. Thread. Window confirmation. Initial creation, 4 days ago. Dormant period, approximately 61 hours. Reactivation cluster, last 6 hours. Primary handles, Pharaoh_12. Sable Glass, Vector Winter, Oxblood, Secondary Late Entrant, Null Harvest, Topic Markers, Window, Payload, Stability, Losses, Uptake, Presentation, Classification. He stared at the word uptake. Still wrong. He added a second column beside each handle. Observed vocabulary frequency, Pharaoh_12, Operational Qualifiers, Conditional Phrasing, Environmental Stability. Sable Glass, Public Interpretation, Optics, Reception Language, Vector Winter, Loss Modeling, Throughput Concern, Timing, Oxblood, Sparse, Reactive, Posture Heavy, Little Substance, Null Harvest, Corrective Language, Controlled Confidence, Technical Compression. Ed came over with 2 crackers and set one beside the keyboard like an offering to a hostile god. "Tribute," he said. Barnes looked at it. "This tastes like drywall saw a therapist." "Still calories. I admire your standards in theory." Ed leaned over the desk and squinted at the screen. "You keep saying the words are wrong." "They are." "How?" Barnes sat back and pointed with 2 fingers at the notes. "Because threat actors borrow language like thieves. They steal from finance, from military jargon, from medicine, from whatever field gives them gravity. But thieves leave drag marks. They overuse what they don't understand. They wear terminology like rented clothing. Shoulders wrong, sleeves too long, stitching bad under pressure. Ed nodded slowly. Barnes tapped the screen again. This doesn't drag. It fits too well in places it shouldn't. Meaning somebody in that thread is either genuinely familiar with clinical or biological language, or very close to someone who is. Ed was quiet for a moment. And that matters because... Barnes turned toward him. Because they're posting on a board dedicated to industrial systems intrusion and municipal infrastructure access. Ed considered that. So, either hackers learned medicine, or medicine learned hackers. That one I don't like. Same. Barnes ate the cracker without enthusiasm and reopened the archived captures from the other onions where Null Harvest had appeared. One dead board connected to procurement chatter. One restricted channel discussing timed release dependencies, tiny footprints, deliberately tiny, the kind of account history designed to survive scrutiny by seeming beneath it. He copied both posts into the notes beneath the thread reconstruction. Null Harvest. Prior post. A. Stability during transit remains the governing variable. Field degradation is below expected threshold. Null Harvest prior post B. Release timing should privilege environmental spread over interpretive clarity. He read that second line twice. Interpretive clarity. There it was again. Not just jargon mismatch, but worldview mismatch. Someone thinking not only about release, but about how observers would misread what they were seeing after release. Not first-order damage, second-order confusion. Barnes felt a small mean pressure gather behind his eyes. This was how real problems announced themselves, not by screaming, but by implying they had already modeled the scream. He opened a second workspace and pulled in the municipal incidents feed he had been collecting, mostly out of habit. The region still produced data the way a dying body still produced heat, inconsistently, often uselessly, but enough to reveal where the process had not quite stopped. Power irregularities, ambulance delays, sanitation route deviations, public works overtime allocations, emergency room overflow chatter caught from scraped local bulletin systems. Anomalies in themselves meant little. This city was one long anomaly wearing a city's skin. But layered correctly, they sometimes formed edges. He started a new document, Municipal Anomaly Correlation, Preliminary. Ed saw the title and sighed. You gave it a heading. That means I lose the rest of the night. You lost the rest of the night when you agreed to know me. Bad decision. Aging poorly. Barnes almost smiled. And yet you stay. Could be concussion. He pulled the city base map onto the right-hand screen. Old municipal parcel data, transportation overlay, hospital locations, sanitation depots, power substations, transit maintenance yards. Half of it was outdated. A quarter had probably been wrong when it was new. Still useful. Cities lied, but they lied in patterns. Barnes began dropping markers. Red for sanitation route irregularities, blue for emergency medical dispatch bunching, yellow for unexplained short-duration power dips, white for chatter involving respiratory distress, agitation, or unclassified events in public spaces. It started as dots. It always started as dots. Then came the temptation, the investigator's oldest vice, to tell a story too early. Barnes forced himself not to. He rebuilt the timeline instead. The earliest strange municipal item in his scrape archive was not dramatic. A sanitation route reroute 17 days earlier, due to hazard processing and decon hold. No public explanation attached. He tagged it. Then came 2 ambulance dispatch anomalies 11 days earlier. Units reassigned from West residential calls to industrial medical fringe support with no corresponding hospital intake note. Tagged. 9 days earlier, a temporary power dip affecting a support corridor east of the civic treatment blocks. Only 7 minutes. Enough to trigger backup systems, not enough to become a scandal. Tagged. 8 days earlier, message board chatter from street-level users complaining that certain service tunnels had been blocked for chemical cleanup. Tagged. 6 days earlier. 3 public incident references describing a violent, disoriented male near a bus cut, a second drug event outside a closed clinic entrance, and 1 sanitation worker missing a shift after an East Side deployment. Tagged. 4 days earlier, the window confirmation thread appeared. Barnes stopped typing. His scalp prickled. Not because the sequence was conclusive. It wasn't. It could still be coincidence braided by fatigue into significance. Cities produce noise. Sick men lash out. Chemicals spill. Power flickers. Sanitation departments lie because lying is cheaper than explaining. But the pattern was starting to exhibit shape, and shape was the first seduction. He leaned back. Damn it. Ed, from the back shelf. That a good damn it or a bad one? Never in your life ask me that after midnight. Bad then. Barnes rotated the monitor toward him slightly. Come admire this with me. Ed came over, took one look at the map and frowned. The markers were not evenly distributed. That was the problem. They didn't cluster around population density the way routine civic disorder would. They didn't follow the random spread of ordinary decay. They bent, loosely, imperfectly, but undeniably, along an eastward support corridor tied to medical overflow, sanitation access, and transit-adjacent service lanes. Not a point source, a route. Ed said, that line means something. Yes. You know what? No. But you hate it anyway. Profoundly. Barnes zoomed in and added a thin gray boundary around the densest cluster. Then overlaid municipal access roads, then old contractor parcel boundaries, then storm drainage routes, because sometimes cities confess their logistics through water. The line sharpened, not cleanly enough for court, more than enough for dread. What am I looking at? Ed asked. Barnes pointed. If this were cyber, I'd say staging corridor. If it were supply chain, I'd say controlled transfer route. If it were public health, I'd say outbreak trace with institutional contamination. And that's exactly why I'm annoyed. Because it could be all 3. Because it shouldn't be speaking all 3 dialects at once. He zoomed again, focused on the eastern cluster, and drew a box around 3 repeated anomaly points: sanitation reroute, power dip, dispatch irregularity. The box sat just west of a neglected service web tied to old annex buildings, contractor lots, and low-visibility municipal property seams. He typed beneath the map, possible structured corridor. Eastward bias. Anomalies align with support/sanitation/low public visibility routes. Language in thread may reference movement through corridor rather than purely digital deployment. Window may indicate release or transfer timing dependent on environmental conditions. Uptake/presentation/classification imply anticipated physical response and observer misidentification, Ed read over his shoulder. You sound worried. Barnes stared at the words physical response. I am trying not to sound insane. Not what I asked. No, it wasn't. That was one of Ed's gifts, stepping over Barnes's language when it became too professional to be honest. Barnes rubbed a hand over his face. Curious first, worried second. Ed waited. Barnes hated him a little for that. The curiosity part, he said, is the usual problem. Something doesn't fit. I pull at it. That's the work. That part I understand. He gestured vaguely at the screens. The worry comes from the fact that every time I pull here, the city answers in a different vocabulary and all of them point in the same direction. Ed looked back at the map. East, he said. East. Rain ticked against the window. Somewhere above them a siren started, coughed, and died. The city was becoming all throat and no voice. Barnes reopened the alias histories. Pharaoh_12 had appeared months earlier in industrial intrusion spaces, but mostly as a responder rather than originator. Technical enough to be real, not important enough to command. His language carried operations manager energy, someone responsible for the process staying within tolerance. Sableglass had a longer trail across semi-closed discussion boards touching information shaping, public confusion, media cycle gaming. Nothing obviously biological, but an obsession with reaction curves, narrative lag, ambient explanation environments. Barnes underlined that phrase in disgust. Vector Winter had almost no traditional intrusion history at all. Instead, there were procurement-adjacent mentions, cold chain logistics, short-haul transit, timed delivery dependencies. Again, not enough alone. Together, ugly. Oxblood was mostly noise, aggressive, posturing, probably useful only as labor or intimidation. Null harvest remained the problem. Sparse history, tight phrasing, no wasted motion. Every intervention in the thread served to narrow interpretation and correct sloppier thinking. Barnes had seen that tone before in good analysts, good surgeons, good prosecutors, and truly bad men. It was the tone of someone accustomed to error happening around them and resenting it on aesthetic grounds. He built a comparison block, alias function hypothesis, Pharaoh_12 equals operations/environmental oversight, Sableglass equals public narrative /misclassification/reaction management, Vector Winter equals logistics/transit/cold chain dependency, Oxblood equals security/enforcement/low-level tactical support, Null harvest equals principal technical coordinator or scientific authority. Ed looked at the list. You can tell that from text. Often. You sure? No, but confidence is a disease and I'm trying to stay healthy. He ran phrase comparison next, not with anything fancy, just manual patterning and a few local text matching tools. He checked for repeated constructions, uncommon pairings, punctuation habits, risk vocabulary, even article use. The machine helped. Barnes trusted the machine only after his own eyes got tired. Pharaoh_12 and Vector Winter occasionally mirrored one another's conditional phrasing, suggesting prior coordination or shared briefing language. Sableglass favored abstract nouns and public perception framing. Oxblood swore too much when pressured. Null harvest barely swore at all and always wrote as though a superior template existed somewhere off-screen. Barnes muttered, "You sanctimonious little ghoul." Ed glanced over, talking to the dead internet again. One of them thinks in briefing documents. That bad? That polished? He highlighted 3 excerpts. Excerpt 1, Null harvest. Early agitation is anticipated. Excerpt 2, Null harvest. Initial presentation will not trigger correct classification. Excerpt 3, prior post. Field degradation is below expected threshold. Then he typed under them, key issue. These are not hacker-native success metrics. Agitation equals behavioral or symptomatic expectation. Presentation equals clinical or observational framing. Classification equals diagnostic/institutional response lag. Field degradation equals material stability outside ideal containment. He stopped typing again. The screen seemed suddenly much too bright. Data curiosity had an engine to it, sharp, clean, almost pleasurable in the ugliest professional way. The feeling of a lock beginning to yield. Barnes knew that feeling better than he knew most people. He had built a life out of following it into rooms sensible men avoided. But impending threat had a different texture, not sharp, heavy. It lived not in the elegance of the pattern, but in the places where elegance implied preparation. Someone had not only built a release model, if that was what this was, they had built expectation around how the release would be misread. They had budgeted for confusion. He hated operations that thought ahead of suffering. It made suffering look like paperwork. Ed had gone back to the shelves and was sealing 2 more water bottles into the secondary bag. You calling anybody yet? Barnes didn't answer. Barnes. No. Why? Because I don't have enough. You never have enough. Correct. That's why my error rate is lower than most people's self-esteem. Ed turned and leaned against the shelving. You worried you'll sound crazy. Barnes looked at the municipal anomaly map, at the eastward line of incidents, at the clipped little language clusters nested inside a hidden service thread no one sane would ever read without gloves. Yes, he said. That all? No? Ed waited again. Barnes sighed. I'm also worried I'll sound right. The room went quiet for a moment except for the infrastructure hum and rain. That was the emotional center of it. Not fear of being dismissed, though that was part of it. Fear of consequence. Fear that the thing forming on his screens would survive contact with daylight. That if he called someone credible, someone with authority and a functional bloodstream, and laid it out properly, they might say the words every investigator learns to dread. Keep talking. Because then the problem would stop being elegant and become real. Barnes dragged the map window larger and started layering timestamps onto the markers, color-shifting them by date, older anomalies in darker tones, recent ones brighter. The corridor did not only exist spatially, it was tightening temporally. The closer the markers got to the present, the more they concentrated toward the east side support web, a route constricting, or a process nearing completion. He opened the transit layer and found a small maintenance spur that paralleled the corridor for part of its length. Look at this, he murmured. Ed came back. Barnes pointed. Municipal support lane, sanitation overlap, disused but not decommissioned transit cut, and 2 contractor parcels with blurred ownership because apparently this city likes its paperwork the way organized crime likes cousins. Ed studied it. You think that thread's about moving something through there? Or from there? What kind of something? Barnes thought of uptake again, didn't answer. Instead, he opened a new note and built the first real synthesis of the case. Preliminary hypothesis, not for dissemination one. Thread participants are not purely cyber actors. At least one appears conversant in biological/clinical framing. 2. Municipal anomalies suggest structured eastward corridor involving sanitation, medical support, and low-visibility service routes. 3. Language indicates concern with release timing, stability during transit, losses, and public misinterpretation. 4. Payload may not be exclusively digital. 5. If physical initial effects may be expected to appear ambiguous or misclassified. He stared at line 4. Ed read it aloud. Payload may not be exclusively digital. That's you being polite. It's me not running barefoot into a conclusion with a gun. Barnes added a 6th line. 6. Directionality appears operational, not rhetorical. There. That was the thing he had been circling since the map started talking back. The language mismatch wasn't random. It wasn't just the presence of medical terms in the wrong room. It was the way those terms aligned with movement language, infrastructure irregularities, and timed municipal anomalies. The wrong words all pointed east, not metaphorically, logistically, directional. He stood up too fast and immediately regretted possessing blood pressure. Ed watched him. That usually means breakthrough or stroke. Maybe both. Barnes paced once across the room, then back to the workstation. The safe house suddenly felt smaller, the walls closer, the shelves less like preparation and more like witness stands. He reopened the thread and read it now with the map in mind. Window holds if environmental factors remain stable, not malware execution environment, possibly humidity, temperature, transport integrity, route conditions. What are projected losses? Not packets, not nodes, material attrition, host failure, spoilage. Within acceptable range. Do not confuse noise with failure. Early agitation is anticipated. Behavioral expression, pre-symptomatic disorder, public incidents, contamination events, and public interpretation, not defender attribution. Civilians, hospitals, local officials, initial presentation will not trigger correct classification. That is the advantage. Clinical misread, delayed response, institutional lag. Barnes sat back down slowly. The curiosity was still there, bright and vicious, because the pattern had deepened, and deepening patterns were catnip to broken men with notebooks. But now it ran alongside something colder. He thought of emergency rooms tagging violent disorientation as narcotics, Street incidents written off as mental health overflow, sanitation reroutes labeled decon, contractor lanes closed for chemical cleanup, power dips excused as grid fatigue. Every institution in a failing city trained by habit to classify the unbelievable as the merely inconvenient. That is the advantage. His mouth felt dry. Ed said, "Talk." Barnes kept looking at the screen. If I'm right, or partly right, then whatever they're discussing is designed to arrive looking like something else. Like what? I don't know yet. He swallowed. But something familiar enough to be ignored for one cycle too long. Ed's face didn't change, but something in him hardened a notch. That thread old enough to mean it already started. Yes. You got symptom reports. Not enough to call them that, but enough to say it. Barnes looked over at the municipal incident list: street violence, agitation, unexplained collapse, respiratory mentions, sanitation holds, support lane activity. Nothing clean. Nothing that would survive scrutiny in sane times. Aviary City was not living in sane times. He pulled the incident snippets into one file and ordered them by date. 17 days, decon hold. 11 days, dispatch anomalies. 9 days, power dip in support corridor. 8 days, blocked tunnels for chemical cleanup. 6 days, violent disorientation near bus cut. Closed clinic incident, sanitation worker absent after East Side deployment. 4 days, thread appears. 6 hours, thread reactivates. He typed a header above the list. Possible early presentation events. Then stopped with both hands on the keyboard. There it was again, language shaping reality. The instant a cautious investigator named a category, the category started recruiting facts. That was the danger. But refusing to name it was another danger. Cities killed through euphemism long before pathogens ever got involved. Ed said quietly, "You're there." Barnes looked up. "Where?" "At the part where curiosity stops feeling fun." Barnes laughed once without humor. "It was never fun." "Liar." He wanted to deny it. Couldn't. Pattern recognition had always thrilled him in the same ugly way a safecracker might admire tumblers. That first moment where nonsense became system, where disorder flinched. But now, the thrill had curdled. Because the system seemed to include people, not users, not victims in the abstract, people in streets and hospitals and sanitation crews and dispatcher queues. People who would not know they were inside a release model until some colder institution told them what to call their suffering. Barnes closed his eyes for a second, then opened them and started one more map. This one's smaller, cleaner. Just the eastern anomaly points. He added route arrows based on timing, not proven movement, inferred progression, each arrow tentative, pale, apologetic. West Service incident to sanitation hold. Sanitation hold to dispatch reassignment. Dispatch reassignment to power dip to street agitation cluster. Street agitation cluster to industrial medical fringe. Thread activity to same corridor. It wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. It was enough to reveal intent, not random spread, guidance, not simply a wrong vocabulary, a vocabulary attached to place. He whispered, "You're moving through the city." Ed heard him. "Who?" Barnes tapped the screen. "Them. Whatever them is, the language, the route, the incidents. It's not just a mismatch. It's directional. It's tied to movement through municipal structure. East. East. Toward what?" Barnes looked at the contractor parcels, the support lanes, the annex webs half hidden in old city records and bad ownership history. "I don't know yet." But that wasn't entirely true. He didn't know the destination. He knew the kind of place, a support zone, low visibility, administratively muddy, close enough to medical infrastructure to borrow its language and perhaps its resources, far enough from scrutiny to stage transfer, containment, or release. An annex, a contractor yard, a sanitation interface, something east that had been designed to look boring. He saved the map as anomaly _corridor _prelim _V1 and mirrored it twice. Then he printed it. The printer coughed, thought about dying, and gave in reluctantly. Ed took the page when it came out and looked at it under the weak overhead light. "This your first real map?" he said. Barnes nodded. "First one I hate." Ed handed it back. "Means it's probably worth keeping." Barnes pinned it to the wall beside the workstation, just above the thread notes. For a second, the room looked almost normal again. A man, a caseboard, a city map, the ritual theater of investigation. But the emotional balance had shifted. Before, the wall had been a workspace. Now, it felt like a warning trying to teach itself grammar. Outside, somewhere beyond the row of ruined municipal blocks, something hit metal hard enough to echo. Neither man moved. After a long moment, Ed said, "What next?" Barnes looked at the map, at the thread, at the incident file he had just renamed with a category he was not yet brave enough to say aloud. Then at the east side of the city, flattened into paper and still somehow growing teeth. "Next," he said slowly, "I stopped treating the weird public incidents as background noise." Ed's expression said he had been waiting for Barnes to catch up to that for at least 20 minutes. Barnes ignored it out of principle. He opened a fresh note file and typed, "Symptom evidence/early presentation review, hospital chatter, scanner traffic, public incident logs, eyewitness fragments, street-level misclassification patterns." He stared at the heading and felt the whole case click one notch deeper. Not solved, not understood, just aligned enough to be dangerous. The mismatch wasn't random. It was pointing, and whatever waited at the end of that point had already started teaching the city how to misunderstand it. Barnes did not sit down immediately after pinning the map. He stood there with the printout in one hand, looking at the eastward corridor on the wall as if it might apologize for becoming real. It didn't. That was the problem with good pattern work. People imagined the reward was clarity. It wasn't. The reward was obligation. Every time a line sharpened, some other comfortable lie lost its footing. The thread had stopped being a weird conversation. The municipal anomalies had stopped being ordinary city decay. The scattered incident notes had stopped being background civic ugliness. One by one, the elegant explanations had begun filing for divorce, and all of it kept bending east. He looked back at the workstation and forced himself through the overlays again, slower now, not because he needed better data, but because he no longer trusted the emotional cleanliness of his own thinking. Sanitation reroute, power dip, dispatch reassignment, street agitation, blocked support tunnel, industrial medical fringe, each one taken alone, still had an ordinary excuse available. Bureaucracy, bad maintenance, drug activity, chemical spill, union fatigue, city incompetence wearing another cheap mask. But together, they did something he had started to hate in his bones. They answered the thread, not directly, not in the satisfying way a decent case did. No smoking log file, no confession with timestamps and a forwarding address. Worse than that. The city was beginning to respond in the same conceptual language the thread had already assumed it would. Transit stability, field variance, correct classification, environmental factors, projected losses. He went back to the notebook and wrote a new line under the map with enough force to dent the page beneath it. The city is already speaking back in the wrong vocabulary. Ed, from the shelves. That sounded dramatic. Barnes did not look up. It felt worse in my head. That's encouraging. No, Barnes said quietly. It really isn't. He sat again and pulled the municipal incident list beside the thread captures, then began matching phrase to place. Window holds if environmental factors remain stable. East side support corridor, closed tunnel, sanitation reroute, power dip, route-dependent movement. What are projected losses? Dispatch irregularities, missing staff, degraded transfer capacity, acceptable attrition implied before public visibility. Initial presentation will not trigger correct classification. Street violence called drugs, blocked service zones called chemical cleanup, violent disorientation folded into ordinary city grime. No one naming anything, because no one had enough courage to sound ridiculous first. Every step hurt the same way, not because the data was dramatic, because it kept becoming legible. Desk work was supposed to feel cold. That was the comfort of it. Screens, notes, maps, timestamps, all the little civilized rituals investigators built so the thing on the other side of the glass could not touch them directly. Only this time, the glass was getting thin. Every overlay dragged human cost into focus a little faster. Sanitation reroute meant workers in the corridor before anyone else knew the corridor mattered. Dispatch reassignment meant medics moved like pieces on a board they did not know existed. Support lane blockage meant somebody had already started teaching the city where not to look. Street agitation cluster meant the first body-level failures had probably already been renamed into something more convenient. The language mismatch was becoming geography, and geography was becoming intent. Barnes sat very still after that thought arrived, because there it was, the sentence that made the rest of the room feel smaller. Not just weird language, not just a route, intent moving through municipal space while the city called it something else. Ed came back over and read the notes upside down. "You've crossed into that part of your process where you stop eating voluntarily," he said. Barnes nodded once. That good?" "No." "What changed?" Barnes looked at the map, then at the thread, then at the municipal markers again. "I kept treating the thread as the active thing and the city as the passive one. Bad sentence. Wrong sentence." He pointed at the wall. "The city is participating now, not knowingly, but materially. The route closures, the support lane weirdness, the dispatch anomalies, those aren't just clues. They're the physical conditions the thread was already thinking in." Ed's expression flattened into the kind of patience he reserved for bad truths arriving on time. "So, the words aren't drifting anymore?" "No," Barnes said. "They're landing." That was the part he could not shake. The thread had not merely contained wrong words in the wrong room. The city had begun generating external conditions that made those words fit better than they should have, which meant the internet portion of the problem was no longer safely internet-sized. It had a root now, and if it had a root, then the next question was no longer academic. It was biological, behavioral, civic. He reopened the incident file and stared at the list of public weirdness he had not yet been willing to dignify with a category. Street disturbances, fever language, transit-side violence, sanitation hold, closed clinic chatter. One report of a man near a bus cut described as sweating through his coat and trying to bite the paramedic, which he had earlier tagged as maybe drugs and now wanted to throw through the wall for having survived that long under that label. The city had not produced enough hard proof yet, but it had produced enough wrong phrasing to make delay feel less like rigor and more like superstition. He created a new heading in the notes. What the map now demands: hospital-adjacent chatter, scanner traffic, public incident logs, eyewitness fragments, transit worker complaints, street-level misclassification patterns. He stopped with the cursor blinking. Ed watched him. Barnes hated that Ed had become so good at recognizing the second before a case changed shape. "This is the next thing," Ed said. "Yeah. You're moving off infrastructure. I'm moving toward consequences." Ed nodded toward the heading. "Say it clean." Barnes looked at the eastward corridor on the wall one more time, then at the thread, then at the city beyond the basement window full of wet concrete, failed lights, and institutions already reaching for easier nouns than the ones the evidence deserved. "When language starts moving through streets," he said, "you stop checking whether the route is real and start checking what it's doing to people." He typed the final line beneath the heading. "The next review is symptoms." And for the first time since he had opened the thread, Barnes understood that he was no longer trying to decide whether the language was wrong. He was trying to find out how long the city had already been living inside it.